Denton, Georgia, Tuesday morning, 8:24 a.m. A man in a navy blue vest steps out of a cafe onto a sunlit sidewalk. 62 years old. Retired law professor. 35 years teaching people their constitutions. He doesn't make 6 steps. Hold up. 2 officers. Moving fast. Eyes already decided. He stops. Raises his hand slightly. Open. Visible. Does everything right. Every single thing his father taught him at 16 that his father's father taught before that. Doesn't matter. You live around here? 30 years, he says. The officer looks at him the way you look at something already made up your mind about. Then the cuffs come out. No warning, no explanation. Just the cold snap of metal in a 62-year-old man's face against the brick wall of a cafe where, 60 seconds ago, the owner knew his order by heart. From across the street, someone raises a phone. They have no idea what they're about to record. Neither do the officers. Neither does the man who thinks this is the worst moment of his morning. He's wrong. It's about to get much bigger than one morning. He did everything right, showed his ID, kept his hands visible, spoke calmly. He was 62 years old, a retired law professor. A man who had spent 35 years teaching other people their rights. And none of it mattered. Because the moment those 2 officers saw him walk down Birch Street in his navy blue vest, the decision had already been made. This is what happened next, and this is what they didn't see coming. James Earl Caldwell woke at 6:15. Not 6:14, not 6:16, 6:15 every morning, for 40 years. His body had stopped needing an alarm sometime around 1987 and never asked permission to keep that schedule. Ruth used to say he was part clock, part stubborn oak tree, and part something she couldn't name but loved anyway. He lay still for a moment, eyes open. Ceiling fan turning slow overhead. The room was quiet the way rooms get quiet when they've been lived in long enough. Not empty quiet, but settled. The kind of quiet that knows you. 3 years since she passed. He still woke on her side of the bed sometimes. Reached over without thinking. Found cold sheets and remembered. He didn't dwell on it. He got up. The vest was dark navy, the color of deep water just before dawn. He'd owned it 11 years. Wore it twice a week. Ruth had picked it out at a shop on Clement Street, held it against him in the aisle, tilted her head and said, "That one. That's the one." He'd worn it to her funeral. He wore it now because some things you hold on to, not because they're useful, but because letting go would cost more than you're willing to pay. 6:45, shoes on, door locked, keys in left jacket pocket, wallet in the right. 6 blocks to Dot's Corner Cafe. He didn't take the car on Tuesdays. Never did. The walk was the point. 22 minutes at a measured pace. 28 if he let himself look at things along the way. The old elm on Marbury Street that leaned so far, Lift seemed to be listening for something underground. The iron fence on Decatur where someone had tied a small red ribbon years ago, faded to pale pink now, still tied. The way October morning light hit the windows on 5th differently than it would in June. Lower, more amber, more honest. He noticed things, always had. 35 years, standing in front of students teaching constitutional law, you learn that the details are where everything lives. The landmark cases, the famous decisions, those were the bones. But the details were the blood. He walked with his hands in his pockets. Breath steady, unhurried. Denton's Georgia was waking up around him. A bus groaned past. A woman in scrubs moved fast with coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, neither eye on the sidewalk. 2 kids on bikes cut the intersection without looking. A delivery man dragged a dolly up a ramp and didn't glance up when James passed. Nobody looked up. That was the thing about Tuesdays. Everyone already somewhere else in their head. James didn't mind. He liked moving through the city at this hour. Anonymous in a way that felt restful. He'd spent so many years being seen, at a podium, behind a desk, in a courtroom, that moving through a crowd unrecognized had become a small, private luxury. He turned onto Birch, smelled the coffee from half a block away. Dot's Corner Cafe sat at the intersection of Birch and 11th. Yellow awning, a little sun-faded. window boxes that Dot replanted every spring with the same purple pansies, because her mother had grown them, and that was reason enough. The sign above the door had been hand-painted every few years since 1993 by Dot's cousin Alvin, who was not a professional sign painter, but was reliable and didn't charge much. The bell above the door chimed when James pushed it open. Dot was already moving. She didn't look up. Reached for the coffee pot, pulled a mug from the shelf, and had it waiting at table 4 before he'd taken 4 steps inside. Table 4, window seat, left side. He could see both the entrance and the street from there. Old habit. He'd chosen seats with sightlines to exits for 40 years. Not paranoia. The practical mathematics of a black man who'd learned early that awareness was cheaper than surprise. He sat. Dot set the mug down. Still said nothing. She was 71 years old, had run this cafe since 1993, and had the efficient grace of someone who'd performed the same acts of care so many times they no longer required thought. Just practice. Just love. Usual, she said. Please. 2 words. Most mornings that was the whole of it. 30 years of friendship had burned away everything unnecessary. She came back with scrambled eggs, wheat toast, a small bowl of sliced melon. He ate slowly. Outside, a pigeon landed on the window ledge, regarded him through the glass with one orange eye, reconsidered, and left. He thought about the Alderman case. The housing documents he'd been working through for 3 weeks. 34 families in the Vine Street corridor, each one sitting on paperwork they didn't understand, each being asked to sign agreements they hadn't had time to read. Relocation clauses. Compensation figures, assessed by firms that didn't live in the neighborhood and wouldn't after this was over either. James had officially retired 2 years ago, but retired and finished were different things. He still held his license. He still made calls. He still sat at kitchen tables with people who needed someone to explain what the fine print actually said. He never charged for it. Never had for this kind of work. Ruth had called it his second job. "Your real job," she'd said once, looking at him over her reading glasses. The first one just paid the bills. He was smiling at that when he noticed his mug was empty. Dot came with the pot, poured without asking, moved on. The cafe hummed around him. A man at the counter was telling a long story about a car repair that hadn't gone right. 2 women near the back leaned over a phone, looking at something that made them both press their lips together. The expression people wear when something is wrong and faintly absurd at the same time. The small television above the espresso machine played weather maps silently, systems moving up the coast. James did not hurry. He'd spent so much of his life moving fast, grading papers at midnight, preparing arguments at 4 a.m., driving to courthouses in cities he barely knew, that this deliberateness felt earned. He had paid for this slowness. In full, $8.23. He left $4 under the mug, more than the coffee cost, less than what it was worth. The bell chimed when he stepped outside. The air had a thin, cool chedjichet, October doing what it does. He was 6 steps from the door. That was all. 6 steps. He had his keys in his hand. He was thinking about the Robinson family, youngest of the 34, 26 years old, with a toddler and another on the way, and whether they'd understood what waiving relocation appeal rights meant in practical terms. He was not thinking about what came next, because there was no reason to. He was a 62-year-old man in a navy vest walking to his car on a street he'd walked 100 times. He was not doing anything wrong. He was not being anything suspicious. He was simply moving from one place to another, the way human beings do, the way human beings are supposed to be allowed to do without interruption. He heard the boots before he saw them. 2 sets, hard soles on concrete. Moving with intention, he turned. 2 officers, both in their mid-30s, one tall, one shorter, both with that particular set to the jaw, hard, eyes as already decided, bodies already certain, before a single word had passed between them and the man they were walking toward. The taller one spoke. "Hold up." James stopped. He was not afraid. Zuz not exactly. Ya was something older and more complicated than afraid. Something practiced, assembled over decades. A composite of every other time in 62 years he'd found himself in this configuration. Standing still, being assessed by someone who had already reached a conclusion. Can I help you? James said. His voice was level. His father had taught him that. Level voice, open hands, no sudden movement. Sought submission. Strategy. The calculus of a man who knew precisely how fast things could go wrong and had decided, a long time ago, that the only variable he could control was himself. The taller officer, badge, stepped closer. ID, he said. Not, sir, could I see some identification? Not, we'd like to verify your information. Just the single word, dropped like a stone into still water. James reached into his right jacket pocket. Slow, deliberate. He produced his wallet, took out his driver's license, held it out with 2 fingers. Mallory took it, didn't thank him. Looked at it, looked up, looked at James. Something passed across Mallory's face, not recognition, not contempt exactly, more like confirmation. As though he'd expected to find precisely what he was looking at, and finding it, was satisfied, and now the rest was procedure. What are you doing here? Mallory said. James kept his eyes steady, having breakfast, at that cafe. He didn't gesture, just indicated with his gaze. Where are you headed? My car, parked on 11th. You live around here? I've lived in Denton 30 years. Mallory handed the license back. The second officer's, Sutton's badge, had shifted slightly to James's left. Not much, just enough. James noticed. We've had reports, Mallory said, of suspicious activity in this area. I see, James said. He waited. Because there had to be more. A description, a time window. Something specific enough to justify stopping a man who had been doing nothing except walking to his car after breakfast. Mallory just looked at him. Do I match a specific description? James asked. Precise. The way a man who spent 35 years teaching people to ask questions asks one, because a real question requires a real answer. I'm asking the questions. I understand that, and I'm cooperating fully. I'd still like to know why I've been stopped. Mallory's jaw tightened, a fraction, just enough. To step away from the building. I'm not near the. Step away. James moved. 1 step back. 2, he put his hands slightly out from his sides, open, visible. He'd sneaked in courtrooms, in decades of case files, in his own life, to know the difference between a moment that could still be managed and one that had already made its decision. This one had already made its decision. Mallory moved forward. And then it happened the way these things always happen. Fast. No announcement, no escalation you could point to. One moment there was space between them, and then there wasn't. A hand on his arm. His arm wrenched behind his back. The cold snap of the cuffs. And God, he would never stop hating that sound, that specific click that said you are no longer in charge of your own banzier. And then Sutton was there too, and James was against the brick of the building, cheek against cold concrete. Don't resist. I'm not. Stop moving. I'm not moving. I'm standing still. He stopped. His father's voice was louder than his own. Don't give them the image they want. Don't give them the shaking man, the shouting man, the man who confirms whatever story they've already decided to tell. That image travels. That image lasts. James went still. His cheek was against the brick, cold. He looked up and sideways, and through his narrowed field of vision he saw the window of Dot's Corner Cafe, the yellow awning, and behind the glass a face, Dot May, standing with a coffee pot in her hand, perfectly still, like something had been pressed onto a pause. Their eyes met through the glass. And James, for just that 1 second, let himself feel it. Not fear. He was past fear, had been past it for a long time. But something underneath fear, something older. The exhaustion of a man who had spent 62 years being reminded, in ways large and small, that the world could decide to stop seeing him as a person at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. He breathed out, and then he put it away. Folded it, set it somewhere inside himself where it couldn't interfere. He had work to do. He could see from where he stood a young man on the sidewalk who had been going somewhere and wasn't anymore. Sitting still, phone raised, recording. He could see a woman at the bus stop across the street who had turned around and was watching. He could see a boy on a bike, maybe 14, one foot on the curb, looking at James and then at the officers and then back at James. His face doing the thing young faces do when they're witnessing something they know is wrong, but don't yet have language for. James saw all of it. Nobody intervened. Not because they didn't care, but because they knew. The same way everyone on that sidewalk who looked like him knew that intervening could cost more than you were prepared to spend on a Tuesday morning. The officers got him upright, one hand on each arm. James walked. He didn't shuffle, didn't stumble, didn't perform anything. He walked the way he always walked, like a man who knew exactly where he was going, even when he hadn't chosen the destination. The holding cell was not remarkable. James had been in rooms like this before. Not many times. Enough times. He recognized the architecture, the narrow bench along one wall, the metal everything, the fluorescent light that managed to be neither bright nor dim but only clinical. He sat down, adjusted his vest, looked at his hands, turned his wrists over slowly, not checking for injury, just accounting. The same reflex as checking your pockets after leaving a restaurant, not because you've lost something, but because you need to know what you still have. He breathed, in, out, measured. If someone had walked past that cell and looked through the narrow window, they might have thought the man's inside was waiting for a bus. That calm, that still, but inside was a different country entirely. Inside was 62 years of accumulated weight, shifting and resettling. His father, who worked 40 years in a mill, and was never once called by his first name by his supervisor. His father, who taught James 3 things about moving through the world as who they were. Stay calm, stay smart, know your rights. Ruth, who used to sit across the kitchen table and read his case files because she wanted to understand every battle was fighting in us. Just the outcome, but the shape of the fight. A private list James carried, not written anywhere, of every time this shape had appeared in his life before today. 19 years old. Coming home from the campus library at 11 p.m. 34. Driving a rental car through a town he'd never visited. 47. Waiting outside a courthouse in a city where he'd won cases. 62. The number sat in him like a stone in a river. Heavy, unmoved by the current around it. He'd told himself, somewhere in the part of himself that still believed in the accumulation of a life, that eventually the sum of it would be enough. The years, the degrees, the 740 students he'd taught, the cases, the work, that eventually all of it would add up to something that read as, this man has already proven himself. This man does not need to prove himself again today. He was still waiting for that math to work. The door opened. She was young, mid-20s, uniform pressed to a sharp crease, hair pulled back cleanly, brown skin, eyes that were careful in the way that comes not from timidity, but from paying very close attention to a world that doesn't always return the courtesy. Her badge said Rees. She set a paper cup of water on the bench beside him, said nothing, looked at him for one full moment, a real moment, the kind that has weight, and then looked away and moved toward the door. Officer Rees, James said. She stopped. Thank you. She looked back. Something moved across her face, brief, controlled, professional surface holding. But underneath it, something registered, something recognized. She nodded once, small, and left. James picked up the water and drank it slowly. He thought about where he'd seen her before, not her face, but the quality of her. The careful eyes, the pause before she turned away. He'd taught students who had that quality. Students who knew the answer and hadn't yet decided they were allowed to give it. He set down the cup. Outside, distant but growing. Voices, not individual voices, the particular texture of collective sound. People, standing together in front of a building, saying the same thing in overlapping waves. He tilted his head. He almost smiled. May did not think of herself as someone who made calls. She was a woman who made coffee, who kept accounts, who planted purple pansies every spring because her mother had planted them, who had outlasted 3 recessions, 2 economic downturns, and 1 burst pipes on January 2009 that had flooded the entire kitchen to the baseboards. She was not the sort of woman who involved herself in things, except she was. She always had been. She just did it quietly, without declaring it, the way some people do the most important work of their lives. Without an audience, without a name for it, just because it needed doing. When the cuffs went on James, she stood so still for 4 seconds. She counted them later. The 4. And then she untied her apron, folded it to the back of her stool behind the counter, walked into the kitchen, where her phone charged on the shelf above the prep table, and called her son. Terrence answered on the second ring. "Mama." "They got James," she said. Silence. "The police? Right outside my front door. 4 minutes ago. Cuffed him. Put him in the car." A different silence this time. Terrence was a journalist, not a television face or a national byline. He worked for the Denton Gazette, had for 11 years, and was good at it in the steady, unglamorous way that meant he'd covered school board decisions and road closures and small elections, and had, over time, built a reputation as someone who wrote what actually happened. Anyone. "Record it?" he said. Dot looked through the kitchen pass-through toward the front window. The young man with the backpack had been standing on the sidewalk with his phone raised. "Yes," she said. "Someone was recording." "I'm on my way," Terrence said. "I know," she said. She hung up. Stood in the kitchen. The eggs she'd been warming were still on the flat top. She turned them off. She went back out front and stood behind the counter for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then she walked to the drawer beneath the cash register and put her hand on the edge of it. Not opening it. Just checking. The slim blue notebook was there. Had been there 8 years. Wasn't going anywhere. She went back to work. Because the cafe still had customers. Because doing nothing wasn't something May knew how to do. By 10 o'clock, Terrence had sent her a text. Videos everywhere. People already heading to the precinct. She didn't reply. She was in the middle of the breakfast rush, but she read it 3 times. The Denton 3rd Precinct was, from the outside, not a dramatic building. Brown brick, 2 stories, a flagpole in front that needed a new rope. The kind of building that announced nothing about what happened inside it. By 10:15 that Tuesday morning, the sidewalks in front of it held close to 150 people. Not organized, not choreographed. Just people who had seen a video or heard from someone who had, and decided to be somewhere other than where they'd been. Some held signs made fast from cardboard and black markers. One sign said only, "We know he is," which was, Terrence thought, exactly the point. He stood near the edge of the crowd with a spiral notebook. Actual paper, actual pen. The habit his editor had insisted on for the first 5 years, and that had never left him. He wrote down what he saw, the size of the crowd, the signs, the way the energy moved through it, not angry in the explosive sense, but sustained. The kind of anger that has been patient for a long time and has finally found a specific place to stand. He wrote down a name. Commissioner Ray Whitfield, 64 years old, 14 years in municipal government. His face appeared on the advisory boards of 3 foundations that funded development across the city's southern corridor, including the Vine Street project, including the project that was working to displace 34 families, including the project that James Caldwell had been quietly helping those families resist for 8 months. Whitfield was standing at the far edge of the gathering, not with the crowd, apart from it. Still, he wore a gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses, and the expression of a man watching a weather system from behind glass, calculating, not frightened. He wasn't looking at the protesters. He was looking at the building. Terrence circled the name, put his pen cap back on. He thought, you don't come and stand outside the building unless something has gone wrong that you thought you'd handled. He thought, something has gone wrong that you thought you'd handled. Inside the precincts, Officer Yvonne Reese was back at her desk, not doing anything at her desk. The paper cup she'd carried to cell 3. The man's face, and he'd said thank you. The quality of his stillness, not resignation, not defeat, something more composed than either. Like someone who had decided a long time ago exactly how he was going to behave in moments like this, and was simply executing that decision. She opened the internal record system, typed Mallory, Brett read. 4 complaints filed over 3 years, all labeled racial profiling, unsubstantiated. 3 reviewed and closed by the same supervis sergeant. A man named Briggs, who had retired 14 months ago with a commendation letter and a small department ceremony. 1 complaint with no review notation at all, just a date of closure. Yvonne read it twice. She was not naive about the department. She'd been here 2 years, and she understood the geography of it, the official structure and the real underneath, which were not the same map. She knew which complaints disappeared. She knew which names were handled carefully and which weren't. She'd been told in ways both explicit and ambient that the job was easier if you learned which questions not to ask. She'd been deciding for 2 years how much of that she was willing to accept. She printed the 4 documents, added a 5th, the Departmental Policy on Complaint Review Timelines, which stated in plain language that all formal complaints required written review within 60 days of filing. 3 of Mallory's 4 complaints showed no review within that window. 5 pages. She held them. They felt heavier than paper. She stood, walked down the hallway to Lieutenant Gerald Drum's office. She'd been watching Drum since he arrived 4 months ago. Watched the way he listened in briefings, not performing attention, actually attending. Watched the way he sat down when he talked to people, which was rarer in that building than it should have been. She knocked. Come in. She walked to his desk, set the 5 pages in front of him without preamble. He looked at the first page, then at her. Mallory's complaint file, she said, plus the review policy. 3 timeline violations, documented. Drum read. He was quiet for long enough that it meant something. You understand what you're doing, he said. Not a question. Yes, she said. It may make things complicated for you here. She looked at him directly. The man in cell 3 helped my family keep their home 20 years ago. He didn't know me. Didn't know my grandfather beyond the case file. He did it because it was the right thing to do. She paused. I think I can manage complicated. Drum looked at her for a moment. Then he opened a folder on his desk and placed the 5 pages inside. Close the door on your way out, he said. I have calls to make. She closed it. Gerald Drum sat alone for a moment after she left. He was 43 years old. Had been a police officer for 20 years, the last 4 months of them here in Denton, after a long posting upstate that he'd left quietly. He believed in procedure, the way engineers believe in load-bearing walls. Not romantically, just as a fact of how things stand up. He was not idealistic. But he had one quality rarer in that building than idealism. He was honest with himself about what he saw. He picked up his phone, called Chief Merritt. 2 rings. Chief, he said, we have a problem. A significant one. You need to come down here. He paused, listened. Yes, ma'am, he said. Now would be the right time. He pulled James Caldwell's name up on his computer and started reading. Sandra Merritt was 54 years old and carried a badge in this city for 26 years. She'd risen through a department that hadn't always been comfortable with her presence in it. Not for lack of competence, but because competence in a black woman produced a particular kind of institutional friction, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that operates in the currency of overlooked recommendations and meetings you weren't told about, and credit quietly redistributed. She'd learned to navigate it. She'd lasted. She was reading a facility's budget report when Drum called. She put it down before she finished the page. She knew James Caldwell's name. Not from any file, not from news archives. From her son. David, who had taken James's constitutional law class at Hartwell University 16 years ago, and come home for Thanksgiving that year, talking about it the way he hadn't talked about school since he was 8, and discovered that sharks could survive in rivers. James Caldwell had pointed David toward public law. David was now a federal prosecutor based in Atlanta. Merritt had never told David to take that class. He'd found his way there himself. She walked through the precinct door 11 minutes after hanging up with Drum. Not running. Walking with the particular economy of motion she'd developed over 2 decades. No wasted movement, no performance of urgency. Urgency that performed itself was, in her experience, usually about the person feeling it rather than the problem requiring it. Drum met her in the hall, handed her the 5 pages. She read them standing, didn't sit down. When she finished, she handed them back. "Where is he?" she said. "Cell 3. She walked. The man in cell 3 looked, at first pass, like a man who had found a way to be somewhere else while remaining physically present. Back straight, hands loose in his lap. Vest still buttoned, as though the morning had not substantially disturbed him. Merritt stood at the door before she opened it. He looked up. They held each other's gaze for a moment. The kind of moment that happens between 2 people who have both decided, independently, that honesty is worth the time it takes. She unlocked the door, stepped inside. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I'm Chief Sandra Merritt." "I know who you are," James said. She stopped, just slightly. "David talks about his mother," James said. "You kept your name until he was in college. He used to call you Chief before you were 1. He paused. He always knew you would be. Merritt stood very still. 26 years on the job. She had trained herself against surprise. She was showing nothing now. But inside, the full geometry of the situations was assembling itself. What had been set in motion this morning, deliberately or carelessly, and what it was going to require to address it properly. Not manage, address. "You're free to go," she said. "Certain. There is no basis for your continued detention." James stood slowly, straightened his vest. "I'd like that in writing," he said. "Before I leave the building, you'll have it." He picked up the empty paper cup Yvonne had left and set it neatly on the bench. A small, precise act of tidiness that said more about the man than anything he could have announced about himself. He walked toward the door, stopped. "Chief Merritt," he said. She waited. "Your son was one of the finest students I taught in 35 years. Not because he was the most brilliant in the room, because he was the most honest about what he didn't know." He looked at her. "You should be proud." He walked past her into the hall. Sansamrit stood in cell 3 for a moment that lasted longer than she intended. Then she thought about Ray Whitfield, who was outside right now watching the building, who had been making the kind of phone calls for the past 14 months that left no obvious trace, who had operated on the assumption, the correct historical assumption, she had to admit, that problems like this one could be shaped into something manageable before they became something else. He had not counted on a woman who kept a blue notebook. He had not counted on Dot. Merritt turned and followed James out, because there was a crowd outside that had earned a reason to disperse. Because there was work that needed doing, and the work started now. James stopped at the front desk long enough to receive the written release that Merritt had ordered prepared. He read it, folded it, put it in his pocket. Then he walked toward the front doors and pushed them open into the October morning. The crowd felt him before they saw him. A shift collective attention, the way a flock of birds turns before any single bird has decided to turn. One moment the energy was directed at the building, at the doors, at the abstract idea of the man inside. And then the doors opened, and there he was. James Earl Caldwell stood at the top of the precinct steps and did not raise his hands, did not smile for the cameras, did not perform relief or triumph or righteous anger for the people holding phones in his directions. He just stood there, in his navy vest, in the October morning, and let the moment be exactly what it was. The crowd responded to that, to the dignity of it. Something in the air changed, not louder, but more focused. The difference between fire spreading and flame held steady. He came down the steps. People moved toward him. People moved toward someone they've been worried about. Not rushing, but unable to hold themselves at a distance. A man he'd mentored 15 years ago, now someone's father, gripped his hand with both of his. A woman who'd been cleaning his gutters every fall for a decade pressed a handmade sign to her chest and just looked at him. Neighbors. Faces from community meetings. People he knew by name and people he knew only by sight, and people he'd never seen before who had come anyway because the video had reached them, and they'd decided that being somewhere mattered more than being nowhere. He shook hands. He listened to each person who needed a moment. He said careful, specific things. Not speeches, not declarations, just the particular words each in front of him required. He was looking for one face. He found it on the left side of the bottom step, apart from the main cluster. May. She hadn't pushed forward. She'd waited, the way she always waited, with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment would arrive without being forced. She had the blue notebook tucked under one arm and a to-go cup in her hand. She held the cup out to him first. He took it. "Your usual," she said. He felt something move through his chest. Not sadness, not gratitude, exactly. Something like the specific relief of being known, of someone having paid enough attention to you across enough years that they understood what you needed without being asked. Ruth had given him that every day for 31 years. Dot gave him a version of it, different in kind. No less real. "Thank you," he said. She held up the notebook. "Dave called," she said. 20 minutes ago. He's on his way." "Good. James." She lowered her voice. Not because anyone was listening, particularly because this part wasn't for anyone else. "Is it going to matter? The notebook?" He looked at her. This woman, 71 years old, on her feet since 5 in the morning, as she had been on her feet since 5 in the morning for 30 years, who had kept a record no one asked her to keep, in a drawer no one knew about, because her mother had lost everything in 1992 without a single scrap of paper to prove what had happened to her. "Dot," he said, "you've been in that book for 8 years. Because you told me to. Because you already knew it was right. I just confirmed it." She held the notebook a little tighter. "My mother never had anything to show anyone. Just her word. And her word wasn't enough. I know. I wasn't going to let that happen here." Her jaws was set in the way it got when she'd decided something. "Not on my block." "It's going to matter," James said. "More than you know." He meant it precisely. Not adds comfort, adds fact. Terra materialized the edge the space between them, notebook in hand, waiting with the particular patience of a journalist who has learned that the best moments aren't rushed. James caught his eye, nodded once. Terrence stepped forward. "Can I walk with you?" he said. "For a block," James said. They moved away from the main crowd, down the sidewalk toward the corner where the noise thinned. James drank the coffee. Terrence held his notebook without opening it. A small courtesy, a signal that this wasn't on the record yet, unless James decided it was. "Your mother's going to be asked to hand that notebook over," James said, "to a federal prosecutor. It may go further than the neighborhood." Terrence was quiet for a moment. "She'll do it," he said. "She's been waiting 8 years for someone to ask." James nodded. He glanced back toward the precinct. The edge of the crowd. The spot where Whitfield had been standing. Empty. Whitfield was gone. At some point in the Yalastuts, he had simply ceased to be there, which meant he was somewhere else, making the that men in his position make when something they thought they'd controlled has revealed itself to be uncontrolled. 11 days until the Vine Street filing deadline. "I need to get back to work," James said. Terrence looked at him. "Today? After all this? Because of all this." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card. Old habit from the classroom, he'd carried them for decades and saw no reason to stop. He handed it to Terrence. "Full name on anything you print," he said. "Spell Caldwell correctly. People always want to add a second L." Terrence almost smiled. James turned and walked toward 11th Street, where his car had been parked since 8 o'clock that morning, untouched, waiting, as indifferent to the last 4 hours as his car can be. He got in, sat for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, not yet turning the key. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror. Once, direct. Then he started the car and drove home. He changed out of the navy vest when he got home. Not because it was ruined. It wasn't. Because what it had witnessed deserved a rest. He folded it carefully and laid it across the back of the bedroom chair. The way Ruth had always said, clothes lasted longer when you treated them like they mattered. He put on a gray cardigan, made fresh coffee, sat down at the kitchen table with the alderman files spread open in front of him. All 34 families, all 34 sets of documents. He worked until 6 o'clock that evening. He thought about Ruth at some point in the mid-afternoon, not with grief, but the way you think about someone who would have been across doing something useful, reading the same pages from a different angle, telling him when his coffee went cold, which she'd done without fail for 31 years, never once letting him drink it cold if she could help it. His coffee went cold. He noticed it eventually, drank it anyway. At 6, he closed the files, made a list of the 3 items he needed to address in the morning, set the list on top of the stack. He ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter, leftovers, adequate, and went to bed at 10. He woke at 6:15. Gerald Drum had a habit when something was wrong. Not wrong in the paperwork sense, not wrong in the schizogen sense, wrong in the structural sense. The way a wall is wrong when the thing holding it up has been quietly compromised for years, and no one has looked closely enough to see it yet. When that kind of wrong appeared, Drum made coffee, not because coffee helped him think, because his hands needed something to do while his mind caught up to what his gut already knew. He'd made 2 cups the morning of James Caldwell's arrest, both gone cold before he finished them. Wednesday morning he came in early, 6:45. Before the shift change, before the bullpen filled, before the institutional noise of the day made quiet thought impossible. He pulled Brett Mallory's full personnel file, not the summary Yvonne had printed, the whole file going back to Mallory's first year on the force. He read for an hour. 4 formal complaints, he already knew. But the file had layers underneath the formal record. 2 informal notes from community liaison officers, written during neighborhood engagement meetings in the Birch Street corridor. Not official complaints, just notes, the kind of documentation that existed in the gray space between observation and action. Both described a patrol officer whose presence in certain blocks produced a particular quality of stillness in the residents. Not calm. The other kind of stillness. The kind that meant, we know this man. We are being careful around him. Those notes were 3 years old. No one had connected them to the formal complaints. No one had looked at all of it together. Drum sat back in his chair. He had been in Denton for 4 months. He had transferred from an upstate posting after 12 years, the official language being career development opportunity, the real language being get out before it costs you something you can't recover. He'd gotten out. He'd landed here. And in 4 months, he had been learning the real geography of the place, not the org chart, but the actual map. Which problems got solved and which ones got filed. Which names were handled with care and which ones weren't. Which patterns were visible to everyone and acknowledged by no one. He'd been cataloging it, telling himself he was still in the phase of understanding before acting. Tuesday morning had ended that phase. He called Merritt. She answered before the first ring finished. "I've been reading Mallory's full file," he said, "and there are informal notes going back 3 years. Liaison officers, neighborhood meetings. They document the same pattern as the formal complaints. Nobody connected them." Merritt was quiet. "Nobody connected them," she said, "because nobody looked at them together. Yes, that's a systemic failure, not an individual one." "Yes," he said again. "The kind where both people are working through the same problem from different angles." "Whitfield called me yesterday," she said. After the release, Drum waited. He offered to help manage the situation. His word, manage. A pause. I recorded the call. Drum absorbed that. How long have you had that recorder on your desk? He asked. Long enough, she said. He almost asked more, decided against it. Some things you didn't need the full history of in order to understand what they meant. What do you need from me? He said. Document everything from Tuesday, your observations, the sequence.
What?
Yvonne's report as submitted. Your own assessment. A pause. Write it the way you'd want it to read if someone examined it in 2 years. Understood. And Drum. Yes, whatever Mallory says to you today, and he will say things, write that down too. She hung up. Drum put the phone down and looked at the cold coffee. He picked it up, walked to the break room, poured it out, and made a fresh cup. Then he went back to his desk and started writing. Brett Mallory arrived for shift at 7:30. He walked into the bullpen the way he always walked into the bullpen. Shoulders chin level, the physical language of a man who occupied space as a matter of principle. He stopped at his desk, turned on his monitor, poured coffee from the communal pot. He did not look at Yvonne, but the not looking was its own kind of look. Yvonne sat at her desk and felt the weight of it, and did not look up from her screen. She had submitted her supplementary report at 7:15 that morning, walked it to the Internal Affairs intake herself, stood at the window and watched off the officer on duty log it and generate a receipt. She had the receipt in her jacket pocket. She did her job, answered calls, completed her morning report, drank her own coffee. At 9:45, Lieutenant Drum appeared in the doorway of the bullpen and said quietly, "Mallory, my office." Mallory set his mug down, looked at Drum for a moment with the expression of a man deciding how to arrange his face. Then he got up and followed. Yvonne did not watch them go. She was already on her next task. Sandra Merritt had her phone in her hand before Whitfield finished dialing. She'd been expecting the call since 6 o'clock that morning. Men like Ray Whitfield did not sleep on situations. They metabolized it overnight and arrived at their moves by dawn. She let it ring twice, picked up. "Commissioner Whitfield," she said. Even, professional. The voice she used for things she needed to be careful with. Sandra, warm, the specific warmth of a man who had spent decades making power sound like friendship. "I wanted to check in. I heard there was some turbulence yesterday. We handled it. I know you did. I don't doubt your capability for a second." A small pause, the pause of a man who has rehearsed the next sentence enough times that it sounds unrehearsed. "I just wanted to offer, if there's any political cucumber needed, any help shaping the public communication on this, I'm happy to make some calls." Merritt reached across her desk. The recording device sat in the left corner, small and unremarkable, installed by her predecessor, and kept by her because she believed in documentations the way some people believe in weather. You didn't argue with it, you didn't romanticize it, you just accounted for it, and worked accordingly. She pressed the button. The small red light came on. "What kind of shaping did you have in mind?" she asked. "Nothing complicated. Routine stop. Miscommunication. Department responds appropriately, acknowledges the concern, moves on. These situations benefit from an early narrative, the right one, established before the other kind takes hold." "The other kind," she repeated. "The kind that gets away from everyone," he said. "That doesn't serve the community, doesn't serve the department, doesn't serve anyone's interests." Merritt was quiet for 3 seconds. Deliberate. "Ray," she said, "do you know who James Caldwell is?" Silence. Not long. Half a second, maybe. But she heard it. The fraction of time in which a calculation happened, in which something was weighed and found to be heavier than anticipated. "I understand he's a retired academic," Whitfield said. "He taught constitutional law at Hartwell for 35 years, she said. "He's the reason my son went into public law." She kept her voice exactly where it had been, friendly, informative. "David took his class 16 years ago. Professor Caldwell is the reason Dave became a federal prosecutor." Another silence, longer. "Sandra, I wasn't aware of that connection. I know you weren't." She let a beat pass. "Is there anything else you wanted to offer, Ray?" He recovered well. She gave him that. His voice, when it came back, had lost almost nothing. "Just my support," he said, as always. "Thank you for the call," she said. She hung up. Stop on the recorder." Sat back. She looked at the device for a long moment. Ray Whitfield had just told her, in the careful, plausible language of a man who had been exercising power quietly for 14 years, that he wanted this contained, that James Caldwell needed to be reclassified. Turned from a story about institutional failure into a story about a misunderstanding that had been handled promptly and professionally. He'd done this before. She knew that now, knew it with the particular clarity that comes when you stop arranging evidence to support the most comfortable conclusion and let it point where it actually points. She'd watched Whitfield for years, had understood dimly that things happened around him that benefited him, had told herself it wasn't her jurisdiction, that there was no hard evidence, that the best she could do was run a clean department and let other people handle what was outside her domain. She picked up her phone, dialed. Her son answered on the second ring. "Mom, David," she said, "I need to tell you something. And then I need your advice." She heard him shift, the small physical rearrangement that meant he'd moved from whatever he'd been doing into the focused stillness he'd had inside childhood, the same stillness James Caldwell had apparently recognized and cultivated in him. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it, timed in sequence, so she'd been trained to relay information, who, what, when, in that order, without interpretation until the facts were complete. She told him about Mallory and Sutton and the arrest, about Yvonne's 5 pages and the 3 unreviewed complaints, about the recording on her desk and what Whitfield had said on it, about James in cell 3, sitting with his hands in his lap like a man who had decided long before morning exactly what kind of person he was going to be inside that room. David listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The notebook," he said. "The one Professor Caldwell mentioned to you. Dorothy May, Dot's Corner, Kefaifi Birch and 11th. I need to talk to her, I know, today." "I know, David." A pause. She could hear him already thinking forward, not emotionally, procedurally, the way James had taught him. "Mom," he said. "Yes, you did the right thing, recording the call." "I know," she said again, and then because it was true and she wanted to say out loud to someone who would understand the full weight of it. "I should have been recording a lot of things a lot sooner." He didn't argue with her. He never argued with her when she was being honest with herself. It was one of the things she'd always respected about him. "I'll drive up today," he said. "Don't let anyone else talk to the cafe owner before I get there." "Go straight to the cafe," she said. "Birch and 11th. She'll be there." She hung up. She straightened the recorder on her desk, stood, buttoned her jacket. She had a full day ahead of her. Starting with Brett Mallory, David Holt drove up from Atlanta. He was 38 years old, with his mother's eyes and his father's chin, and the quality of stillness that people who had known him since childhood attributed variously to temperament, to training, or to the 16 weeks he'd spent in James M. Caldwell's constitutional law seminar, which had taught him, among other things, that the most important thing a person in his line of work could do was stop talking and actually listen. He arrived at Dot's Corner Cafe at 4:15. The afternoon light was low and long, cutting across the yellow awning at an angle that turned the whole front of the building amber, the color of something caught mid-memory. The cafe was technically closed, but the lights were on. Dot opened the door before he finished knocking. She looked at him the way she looked at things, fully, without rushing to the next thing. "You look like her," she said. "Everyone says that. It's meant as a compliment." "I know." She let him in. Without deliberating about it, or perhaps having deliberated precisely, she pointed him to table 4. Window seat, left side. He sat. She put the blue notebook on the table between them. He looked at it. Didn't reach for it yet. "How long?" he said. "Spring of 2016, she said. "First time one of Whitfield's people came in here. Sat right where you're sitting." She nodded at the chair. Ordered a coffee he didn't touch. Asked me how much I'd take for the building if I ever thought about selling. What did you say? That it wasn't for sale. And then? He left a card. And then someone different came the next month. Different face, same questions, and the month after that, someone different again. She paused. They kept changing the face. They never changed the questions. David was quiet. James told me to write it down, she said. I already knew to. He just told me how, dates, names, exact words when I could remember them, amounts when there were amounts. Not what I felt about it, just what happened. And you did that? For 8 years. He reached for the notebook. He opened to the first page, and he read. Dot sat across from him and drank her own coffee, which had gone tepid, and watched him read. She'd learned, over 71 years, that there were 2 kinds of readers, those who processed text as information to be acquired and filed, and those who actually went somewhere when they read, who left the present tense and came back from it, changed. David Holt went somewhere. He read for 37 minutes without looking up. His face during that time was still and concentrated. The expressionless, that is, if you know how to read it, very expressive indeed. When he finished, he closed the notebook with both hands. Set it down carefully. The gesture of someone who understood what they were holding. Dorothy, he said. Dot. He looked at her steadily. What you've done here, the consistency of it, the precision, this is exactly what a legal proceeding requires. Contemporaneous records, specific dates, named individuals, documented statements. He paused. This is evidence, real evidence, the kind that holds. She nodded. There's a name in there 3 times, she said. I want to ask you about it. I saw it. Sandra Merritt. Before she was chief. Dot looked at him directly. Your mother signs off on 2 of those early corridor assessments. She didn't know what she was approving, did she? David took a moment with the question, not avoiding it, finding the truthful answer inside it. I think she didn't ask the questions she should have asked, he said, and I think she knows that now. Dot considered that. She's not a bad person, she said. I never thought she was. I thought she was a person who worked inside a system that made it easy not to look too hard at certain things. That's accurate, he said. The system counts on that, Dot said. That's what the system is for. He looked at her for a moment. You know, he said, Professor Caldwell used to tell her class that the most important person in any legal matter wasn't usually the lawyer or the judge. It was the person who'd been paying attention the whole time. Everyone else looked the other way. Dot picked up her tepid coffee. He told me something like that once, she said. About 10 years ago. I thought he was just being kind. He doesn't do kind, David said. He does accurate, she laughed. Small, real. What happens now, she said. I take this back to Atlanta. I speak to my supervisor. We open a formal investigation in Ray Westfield and his associates parked in the Vine Street corridor. He looked at her directly. It will take time. It may require your testimony. It will be unglamorous and slow and occasionally frustrating. I've been keeping that notebook for 8 years, she said. I think I can manage unglamorous and slow. He nodded. Stood. He picked up the notebook. I'm going to have this photocopied tonight. I'll return the original to you within a week, and then it enters evidence storage through proper channels. He paused. Climate-controlled, federal building. Your handwriting will be very well cared for. My handwriting in a federal building, she said. Yes. She thought about her mother, about 1962, about a house taken from a woman who had nothing to show anyone but her own word, and her word hadn't been enough. My mother would have had something to say about that, she said. What would she have said? Dot looked out the window. The afternoon shifted into early evening, the light cooling from amber to something grayer, and the street outside had changed registers the way it did between 4 and 6. People moving differently, the city settling into its evening self. She would have said, finally, Dot said. David Holt put the notebook carefully inside his briefcase. He shook her hand with both of his, full attention, both hands, eyes on her face, and walked out. The bell above the door chimed. Dot stood behind the counter for a moment after he left. Then she picked up the coffee pot, stirred a fresh batch for the morning, and called Terrence. "Your article," she said when he answered. "Spell Caldwell with one. I know Mama." "Just checking," she said. "Just checking." Yvonne Reese did not go home after her shift ended. She told herself it was paperwork. Both things were true, and the second was the real reason. She stayed at her desk until 7 o'clock, filed her reports, answered her messages, did all the ordinary work of an afternoon becoming an evening in a police precinct. The small, persistent tasks that didn't announce themselves as meaningful, but were, in aggregate, how things stayed honest. Her grandmother called at 6 that evening. "Yvonne, Grandma, how are you? I saw his face on the news last night. James Caldwell, outside the police station." Yvonne was quiet. "You work there," her grandmother said. The silence that followed was not an accusation. It was a question, the one that only someone who loved you enough to wait for the true answer would ask, and had the patience to wait for. "Did you do right by him?" her grandmother said. Yvonne looked out the window of the precinct. The street was quiet now. The crowd long dispersed. Just the ordinary evening traffic of a city that had moved on to other things, unaware that anything had shifted. "I tried to, Grandma." "Good." A pause. "Softer now. That man gave your grandfather back his dignity, when the whole system was telling him he didn't have any left. You understand what that means?" "I do." "Then you did right," her grandmother said. "That's enough." She hung up. Yvonne set the phone down on her desk. She sat for a moment, just that. Then she got back to work. Brett Mallory's suspension came through on Thursday morning, 2 days after the arrest. Fast by the department's usual license, which was itself a message to Mallory, to the bullpen, to anyone paying attention to the speed at which certain decisions got made when the right pressure was applied from the right direction. Merritt called him into her office at 9 a.m. Drum was there. An internal affairs representative named Greedeer, who was 60 years old and had the face of a had seen too many of these meetings and had stopped being surprised by any of them. The union rep, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who sat to Mallory's left and said nothing for the duration. Mallory sat down. He looked at Merritt the way he'd looked at James Caldwell on Birch Street. Direct, sat, the posture of a man whose confidence had never fully separated itself from the assumption that he was the one who got to decide what mattered in any given room. That posture had served him for a long time. It had never been seriously tested. It was being tested now. Merritt placed 3 documents on the desk in front of him. She didn't explain them. Let him read. He looked at the first one, then the second. His expression shifted. Not much, but enough. The jaw tightened. A small muscle at the corner of his eye. He looked up. "Who filed the supplementary report?" he said. "That's not your concern right now," Merritt said. "It's my career." "Officer Mallory." Her voice was quiet. The specific quiet of a decision already made, already past the point where volume was necessary. "You are suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation into Tuesday's arrest and the pattern of conduct documented in your personnel file. You will not return to this building, and you will not contact any personnel involved in this matter until the investigation concludes. Is that understood?" He was still for a moment. "This is because of one arrest," he said. "One stop." Merritt looked at him. "No," she said. "It's because of 4 complaints and a pattern and a 62-year-old man who did every single thing you asked him to do and ended up in handcuffs on the sidewalk anyway." She held his gaze. "And because I am done looking the other way," she said the last sentence simply, without drama. "The way you state something that has been true for longer than you admitted and has finally irrevocably been named out loud." Mallory looked at Greer, at Holloway, back at Merritt. He stood up. He walked out. Nobody spoke until the sound of his footsteps had moved all the way down the hall and the outer door had opened and closed. Then Greer said, "We'll need the full file by end of week." "You'll have it Monday," Merritt said. He nodded and left. Holloway gathered her papers, paused at the door. For what it's worth, she said, not looking back, that file should have been reviewed a year ago. She left. Drum and Merritt sat alone in the office. Dale Sutton, Drum said, I'll talk to him this afternoon. She did. That conversation lasted 11 minutes. Sutton sat across from her with the look of a man who had already been having a conversation with himself for 48 hours and had arrived at an answer he didn't like but couldn't argue with. He submitted his resignation letter the following week, typed it himself, filed it through proper channels, was gone by Friday. Nobody made a speech about it, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing that happened that week. James filed on a Monday, 11 days after the arrest, as planned, as scheduled, as the deadline required. He drove to the courthouse at 8 in the morning and parked in the structure on 4th Street and took the elevator to the 4th floor and stood at the filing window with a stack of documents that represented 8 months of kitchen table meetings and late evenings and 34 families trusting him with the most consequential paperwork of their lives. The clerk, a woman in her 50s who had the expression of someone who had processed 10,000 filings and found each one equally deserving of her full attention, took the stack, reviewed the top sheet, stamped the copies, handed James his set. Have a good day, she said. Thank you, he said. You too. He walked to the elevator, took it down, walked through the lobby and out the front doors into the November morning. November now. The trees had gone fully. The light was lower, grayer, the particular flat illumination of the south in late fall that never quite committed to being cold but wasn't warm either. He stood on the courthouse steps. Just that, just standing. 34 families. The Robinsons with their toddler and the baby coming. The Washingtons, who had owned their house since 1971. Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, 83 years old, who had sat at her kitchen table with her hands folded and told James on their first meeting that she didn't want money. She wanted to stay. This was her street. These were her neighbors. She had buried her husband from that house. She intended to be buried from it herself. He had that image in his mind when he called Dot from the car. It's filed, he said. A pause, then, oh, thank God. All 34, full filing, deadline met, he heard her exhale. The specific sound of someone releasing breath they've been holding for weeks. Come in tomorrow morning, she said. I'll make something special. The usual is fine. The usual is always fine, she said. But tomorrow you're getting something better. He didn't argue. He drove home. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the alderman files, and went through each one again. Not because the filing required it, but because he wanted to know they were complete. Wanted to hold each family's paperwork in his hands and confirm, page by page, that nothing had been left undone. Nothing had. He stacked the files, set them by the door for the morning. He sat at the table for a while after that. Not working, just sitting. He thought about Ruth. The specific way she would have sat across from him right now. Not saying much, maybe reading something of her own, occasionally looking up to check on him the way she'd done for 31 years. That particular glance that wasn't checking on him so much as confirming that he was still there, himself, still the man she'd chosen. He missed her with the kind of precision that grief eventually becomes. Not the general ache of early loss, but the specific idiotism's knowledge of exactly what is absent. The particular weight of the chair across from him when it was empty. He got up, made himself dinner, went to bed at 10. At 6:15, he woke up. The investigation into Ray Whitfield moved the way federal investigations move. Deliberately, quietly, in increments that were invisible from the outside until, without warning, they weren't. David Holt worked it from Atlanta with 2 colleagues and the kind of methodical patience that James Caldwell had spent 16 weeks building into him. The method was simple and non-negotiable. Evidence first, interpretation after, and never in the other order. You did not decide what had happened and then assemble the record to confirm it. Thus you assembled the record and let it point where it pointed. It pointed at Whitfield. He had Dot's blue notebook, photocopied 4 times, the original now in a climate-controlled evidence locker in a federal building. A fact Dot both reassuring and in the specific way of a woman who had spent 30 years making coffee and keeping accounts, faintly absurd. He had the recording from Merritt's desk. He had Yvonne's 5 pages and the 3 documented timeline violations. He had a paper trail through the Vine Street Project's assessment process that, once you understood what you were looking at, read like a map with the destinations already marked. Whitfield had been careful. He was, by nature and by practice, a careful man. But careful men, in David's experience, made the same fundamental error. They believed that careful was the same as invisible, that the absence of obvious fingerprints meant the absence of evidence. They forgot about the people who had been paying attention the whole time. The ones who wrote things down, not because anyone asked them to, but because they believed the truth deserved a witness, even when no one was watching. Dot May had been a witness for 8 years. In November, Terrence's story ran in the Denton Gazette. Full account of the Vine Street Project, the assessment irregularities, the October arrest of James Caldwell, and the subsequent discovery of 4 unreviewed police complaints and a documented pattern of conduct. Above the fold. Full name. Timeline laid out with the precision of someone who had been keeping his own notes for 4 years and had learned, the way good journalists learn, that the story is in the sequence. By Wednesday of that week, 2 regional outlets had picked it up. By the following Monday, a national wire service had filed a version of it. None of this was the investigation. The investigation was quieter than all of it, moving through offices in Atlanta and conversations that left no public record. But the stories created a context, a documented, date-stamped, publicly available context that made certain kinds of maneuvering harder, made the idea of a quiet resolution in anyone's favor harder, made it more difficult for anyone to look at what had happened and say, "This was a miscommunication, a misunderstanding, a situation that has been handled and from which everyone can now move forward." The situation had been handled. The moving forward was going to take longer. Ray Whitfield resigned from the commission in January. He submitted the letter on a Friday afternoon, the specific Friday afternoon of a long weekend. The timing of a man who still believed that news cycles could be managed if you understood how they worked. He was wrong about that. Terrence had a source in the clerk's office. The story ran Saturday morning. Whitfield issued a brief statement through a communications firm that specialized in language which expressed regret read without admitting anything, and then went quiet. His attorney, a careful Simons named Forsyth, who had navigated many situations of this kind, advised silence. Whitfield stayed silent. The investigation continued. In April, David Holt's team filed formal charges. 3 counts. Abuse of public office, improper influence over a municipal bidding process. And the third, the one that had taken the most time to construct correctly, the one David had returned to the record again and again to make certain it would hold. Conspiracy to intimidate a lawful activity built on the documented pattern of targeted interference with individuals with associated bilsit with the Vine Street community opposition. James Caldwell's arrest on October the 8th was the most recent and most thoroughly documented instance of that pattern. It was not the only one. The charges were announced on a Tuesday morning. James was at Dot's when Terrence's text arrived. He read it, set the phone down, picked up his coffee, looked out the window at a November street going about its business in the gray, late morning light. He did not feel triumphant. He had stood in enough courtrooms over enough years to know that triumph was brief and lived close to the surface, and that what it usually was, underneath, was relief. The relief of something being named correctly. Of the world for a moment, describing itself with accuracy. He felt that. And underneath it, something quieter. Something connected to 34 kitchen tables and 34 sets of documents and Mrs. Elizabeth Briggs, 83 years old, hands folded on her tablecloth, saying, "I intend to be buried from this house." That was what the charges meant. not victory. The possibility of something continuing that should never have been threatened. He finished his coffee. He had work to do. Sandra Merritt stood before the Civilian Oversight Committee in February. The hearing room held 40 people. All 40 seats were full. There were cameras. There were reporters. There were 6 committee members at the curved table at the front of the room, and Merritt sat across from them alone, without counsel, which she decided deliberately. Because bringing a lawyer to a hearing about institutional accountability sent a message she did not want to send. She answered questions for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The committee chair was a man named Aldridge, 61, former city councilman with the focus of impatience of who had sat through too many hearings where the person across from him told him what they thought he wanted to hear. He had not so far gotten what he wanted to hear from many police chiefs. He watched Merritt, the way a person watches something they haven't yet decided whether to trust. "Chief Merritt," he said an hour in, "the complaint file on Officer Mallory. 4 complaints over 3 years, 3 reviewed and closed by the same supervisor. 1 with no review at all." He leaned forward slightly. "How does something like that happen in a department you run?" Merritt looked at him directly. "Because I didn't look?" she said. Aldridge waited. "There were systems in place for complaint review," she said. "I received summary reports. The summaries showed complaints received and complaints resolved. I did not examine the resolutions closely enough. I did not ask the questions I should have asked about the pattern." She paused. "That is a failure of oversight. My oversight. I am accountable for it." Aldridge made a note. A second committee member, a woman named Garrison, younger, with the careful directness of one who had earned her place in that room and intended to use it, leaned forward. "Chief Merritt, in your estimation, is this a failure of one supervisor, or is it indicative of something larger within the department?" "Larger," Merritt said, without hesitation. "The individual failure was possible because the structure made them possible. A culture in which certain slings were treated as administrative noise rather than substantive concerns. That culture did not originate with Sergeant Briggs. It predates him. It predates me." She looked at Garrison directly. "That is what we are working to change." "Tell us about that work," Garrison said. Merritt did. She walked them through the new complaint review protocol, mandatory review timelines, second sign-off requirements, automatic escalation triggers when patterns appeared across multiple complaints from the same officer or same corridor, an anonymous reporting channel for residents and for officers, body camera policy revisions that closed 3 loopholes that had existed, unaddressed, for 6 years. She walked them through the new training framework. Not a one-time session, but a continuous program, with quarterly assessments, with real consequences, with external oversight from a review board that included community members who were not affiliated with the department. And then she walked them through one additional item: a clinical partnership with Hartwell University's law school. Second and third-year students working directly with the department on policy review. A formal bridge between the institution and the people it was accountable to. "The program has a faculty advisor," she said. "He is a retired professor of constitutional law with 35 years at Hartwell. His name is James Earl Caldwell." The room was quiet for a moment. Aldridge looked at his notes, looked up. Same James Caldwell who was." "Yes," Merritt said, "the same." Another silence. "And he agreed to this?" Aldridge said. "He did," she said. "He starts in March." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. He had, in 22 years of public service, developed a reliable sense for the difference between an institutional response that was genuine and one that was performance. The difference was rarely in the words. It was in the texture beneath the words. The willingness to say hard things plainly. The absence of the particular smoothness that appeared when someone was managing a narrative rather than acknowledging a reality. He made another note. "We'll want quarterly reports," he said, "starting in June." "You'll have them," Merritt said. She walked out of the hearing room 2 hours and 40 minutes after she swung in. Drum was waiting in the hallway. He'd sat in the public gallery for the full duration. She hadn't asked him to. He'd come because he thought it mattered that she not walk out of that room alone. "How did it go?" he said. "The way it needed to," she said. They walked out together into the February cold. James got the call from Hartwell in the second week of February. Not from the dean. From Brianna Wells, 31 years old, assistant professor, one of the most persistently rigorous students James had taught in his final decade. She had the quality, rare in any academic setting, of treating every conclusion as provisional until the evidence made it otherwise. She had argued with him in class on 3 separate occasions. She has been right twice. He had told her so, directly and in front of the room, because he believed that being right in public deserved acknowledgement in public. She called on a Thursday afternoon. "Professor Caldwell, Brianna, you can call me James." "I've tried," she said. "It doesn't feel right." He almost smiled. She outlined the clinical program. Students working on real policy review, real engagement with the department's actual complaint and conduct systems. Not simulation, not hypothetical exercise. The actual documents, the actual procedures, the actual gaps between what the policy said should happen and what the record showed had happened. "We want you to advise it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the kitchen table and for 35 years and the retirement he'd taken because his body had finally asked for it, and he'd decided it was time. He thought about Ruth's voice saying, "Your real job." He thought about cell 3 and the cold bench and Yvonne's paper cup and the 4 seconds it had taken May to untuck her apron and pick up the phone. "What would involve," he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting. The full outline, the structure, the expectations, the time commitment, the scope. "1 semester to start," he said. "1 semester. We reassess from there. I'd want input on the curriculum. That's why we called you." "Tuesdays need to stay free," he said. She didn't ask why. "Done," she said. "Then yes," he said. He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes after that, not thinking particularly. Just sitting with a decision that wasn't really a decision. The kind where some part of you already knew the answer before the question was asked, and conversation was just the formality of saying it out loud. He got up, made coffee, sat back down with the Vine Street files. He had a hearing to prepare for. He had work to do. The first class met on a Wednesday morning in March. 14 students. Second and third years, filling the front 2 rows of a seminar room on the 3rd floor of Hartwell's law building. A room James had taught in for many years, which felt different from the front than it had from anywhere else. More intimate, or perhaps he was different, and the room was simply Sim itself. He stood at the front. He looked at them. 14 faces. Young, alert, the full range of second-year confidence. Some leaning forward already, certain they would say something worth hearing, others sitting back with the careful watchfulness of people who had learned that listening was more useful than performing. All of them there because they wanted to do something with what they were being taught. That wanting was visible on them, close to the surface, not yet worn down. He had always loved that about students. The wanting before the years began their work on it. He let the room settle. Then he told them about October, not the curriculum, not the program overview, not a case study from another city in another decade. October, his October. He told them about the walk to Dots, the coffee, the 6 steps from the door of the cafe. He told them about Mallory and Sutton, and the one-word command, ID, and the cuffs and the cold brick, and what he'd looked at while his cheek was against it. He told them about his father's voice. He told it plainly. The way he'd always taught his students to approach the record, not to support a conclusion, just laid out in sequence, one thing following the next, and then you look at what it shows. When he finished, the room was quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet of people waiting for someone to fill the silence. The other kind, the kind that means something arrived. A student in the 2nd row raised her hand, close-cropped hair, notebook open, pen not moving. The kind of student who had learned that some things required her full attention and her pen could catch up later. "Were you afraid?" she said. He looked at her. He let the question exist for a full moment before he answered. Because the honest answer required location. "Yes," he said. She would. "Not in the immediate physical sense," he said. "What I felt wasn't about the next 5 minutes. It was something older." He looked at the room, not at any one face, at all of them. The fear that the sum of your life doesn't protect you, that the years, the work, the people you've tried to serve, that all of it can be set aside by someone who decides in a single moment that none of it applies. Nobody moved. "What do you do with it?" she said. "What my father taught me," which is what his father taught him. He looked at her. "You put it somewhere it can't interfere with what has to happen next. You stay in your body. You breathe. You don't give them the image they've already decided to see." He paused. "And then, afterward, when you're somewhere safe, you let yourself feel it. All of it. You don't skip that part. If you skip it, it accumulates. It comes out in ways that cost you more than facing it did." A student in the back, male voice. "Careful. Is that what you did? Afterward?" James thought about the kitchen table. The files, the cardigan, the cold coffee he'd drunk anyway. "Eventually," he said. The word landed without decoration. "All right," James said. "That's enough about October." He walked to the board. He wrote 2 words, precision, accountability. "These are not the same thing," he said. "People inside institutions, good institutions, institutions that believe in themselves, confuse them constantly. Procedure is the map. Accountability is whether you actually went where the map said." He turned to them. The Denton 3rd Precinct had a complaint review procedure. It did not have accountability. "We are going to spend this semester understanding the difference, in specific, technical, documented terms, using the actual records from an actual department that failed in an actual and verifiable way." He looked at them. "This is not a seminar about what went wrong somewhere else. It is a seminar about what goes wrong inside systems. Every system, including the ones you will one day work inside. You are going to learn to see the gap between the map and the territory. And then you are going to learn how to build something that closes it." 14 people reached for their pens at the same time. That reaching. Simultaneous, instinctive. He'd seen it 1,000 times in 35 years, and it had never stopped meaning something. He turned back to the board and began. After class in the hallway, Brianna was waiting. She'd been in the doorway for the last 40 minutes. He'd registered her without acknowledging it. A courtesy, and also a recognition that she was doing what she needed to do, which was assess whether the program she'd built was going to be what she'd hoped. "You went 45 minutes over on the personal narrative," she said. "Yes. You skipped the program overview entirely." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "It was the right call," she said. "Obviously, I know. I just want you to know that I know." He picked up his bag. They walked down the hall together, the particular ease of 2 people still inside the atmosphere of a room that had mattered. Outside, March was doing its tentative work, cold but reconsidering. The trees on the Hartwell grounds in that state of suspension just before commitment. A few buds showing, nothing declared yet, the question still open. "They listened differently than I expected," Brianna said. "How did you expect them to listen?" She thought about it, like they were receiving someone else's experience, filing it. "You know how students do sometimes. They absorb the story as material." She paused. "They didn't do that." "No," he agreed. "They listened like it was about them." "Because it is," he said. "Every one of them will stand inside a system at some point. Every one of them will face a moment where the easier choice and the right choice aren't the same thing. That's not abstract for them." He looked at her. "That's next year." She nodded. They reached the car park. He stopped at his car. "Same time next week?" she said. "Same time next week," he said. He drove home. The last Tuesday in May. The elm on Marbury Street was fully leafed now, the long lean of it gentler under summer weight. All winter it had looked like something bracing against a wind that wasn't there. Now it looked like what it was. An old tree that had found its angle and kept it, year after year, through everything. The ribbon on the fence on Decatur had gone from pink to something between pink and white. Still tied, still there. 9th or 10th year by James's rough count. He'd stopped trying to remember exactly when it had appeared. It was simply part of the route now. One of the fixed things. The light on 5th at 8 in the morning in May was long and warm and had none of October's urgency. October light was amber and low and moved like it knew something you didn't. May light was more straightforward, more generous. It didn't withhold. James walked, in his pockets, pace measured, 22 minutes. He'd been walking this route every Tuesday for longer than he could precisely recall, through 3 administrations at Hartwell. Through the years when Ruth walked beside him and the years after, when he walked alone and the route was the same but the walking was different. Not worse, exactly, but changed in the way everything changes when the person who made it what it was is no longer there to make it. He thought about her this morning without the usual layer of careful management he'd developed over 3 years. Just thought about her. The way she'd pulled her coat collar up against October mornings. The specific sound of her laugh at something that surprised her. The way she'd written in the margins of his case files, not editing, just noting, small, precise marks that meant, I was here, I read this, I was paying attention. He'd been thinking about that margin habit since he got a letter from the Hartwell archive 2 weeks ago. They were digitizing the papers of retired faculty. Would he like his materials collected and preserved? He'd said yes, without thinking too hard about it. And then he'd spent an evening going through the files in the back study. The case files, the lecture notes, the student correspondence he'd kept over 35 years. And he'd found, in a folder he hadn't opened in 4 years, 3 pages of notes in Ruth's handwriting. Not about any case in particular. Just observations, written on a yellow legal pad, dated November 2020. He'd read at them, standing in the study with his coat still on. He hadn't known those pages existed. He still didn't fully know what to do with the fact of them. He turned onto Birch. The cafe was a half block ahead. Yellow awning, Alvin's sign. The window boxes had been replanted last month. Dot's annual ritual, the purple pansies, the same ones every spring because her mother had grown them, and that was reason enough and no other reason was needed. He pushed open the door. The bell chimed. Dot was already moving. She had the mug at table 4 before taking 3 step, poured without asking. Moved back toward the kitchen. He sat. He looked out the window. The street outside was doing what streets in late May do, warming into itself, people moving with the looser energy of a city that has remembered how to be outside after months of moving fast and hunched against the cold. A man walked a dog that was treating every crack in the sidewalk as a matter of urgent professional inquiry. A woman in a yellow jacket stood at the corner, with her face turned up to the sun, eyes closed, just that. Just the sun on her face for 10 seconds. And then she looked at her phone and moved on. James watched the street and drank his coffee, and did not think about anything in particular, which was the point of Tuesday mornings. The thinking happened the other 6 days. Tuesday was for being present in the specific small, unremarkable fact of a life continuing. The Vine Street hearing had concluded 3 weeks before. The judge's preliminary ruling had come down the previous Monday, favorable on 4 of the 5 central claims, with the 5th sent back for additional documentation that James had already prepared and submitted. It was not the end of the case. Cases didn't end in the clean final way people imagined. They moved through phases, each one opening onto the next, and what you hoped for was not a conclusion so much as a direction. The direction was right. Mrs. Briggs had called him Sunday evening. She hadn't said much. She'd said, "Thank you, James." And then, "My husband would have been glad to know you." And then, "Good night." He sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after that. He was still sitting with it, in some sense. The way certain moments stayed with you, not because they were dramatic, but because they were exact. Because they named something precisely that had been circling without landing. Dot came back with the food. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, the small bowl of melon, set it down. And then, unusual, not her habit on busy mornings, she pulled out the chair across from him and sat. He looked at her. What? Said. Nothing. She folded her hands on the table. I just wanted to sit for a minute. He waited. With Dot, waiting was always right. I've been thinking about my mother, she said. Tell me. She lost everything. The house, the neighborhood, everything she and my father had built over 20 years. Dot looked at her hands, and she never stopped believing things should be different. She just didn't have a way to make them so. No paper, no record, just her word, and her word wasn't enough. He listened without filling the pause. I used to think the notebook was for her, Dot said. Like I was keeping it in her name, making her loss mean something retroactively. She was quiet. Now I think it was just what was right to do. And she knew that her whole life, knew it even when she had nothing to write with. She wasn't asking me to write it for her. A pause. I think she'd be tired of me making it about her grief instead of her sense of what was right. James looked at her, not with the professional attention he'd given 35 years of students, something older than that. The attention of someone who had known a person long enough to understand when they were saying something they'd been working toward for a while. She probably want you to get back to work, he said. Probably, Dot said, and then almost smiling. She was not sentimental. No, she was practical. She grew pansies because they came back every year without much help. She kept records because records are how things get proven. Dot looked out the window. I thought I was honoring her. Maybe I was just doing what she taught me. Those aren't different things, James said. Dot considered that. She almost stood. Then she looked at him again. You know what David told me when he came for the notebook. What did he say? He said you used to tell your class that the most important person in any legal matter wasn't the lawyer or the judge. It was the person who'd been paying attention the whole time everyone else looked away. He held her gaze. I told him I thought you were just being kind, she said. I'm never kind, he said. I'm accurate. She laughed. Really laughed. The kind that starts in the chest and arrives without preamble. Kind you couldn't plan or perform. She got up, took the coffee pot back to the counter, moved into the morning work of the cafe with the ease of someone doing somethings they'd done long enough that their body simply knew how. He watched her for a moment. He thought about all the Tuesdays, before Ruth was gone and after, before the arrest and after, before the notebook mattered to anyone but Dot and after, the cafe the same across all of it, Dot the same, the bell above the door, the mug at table 4, some things you couldn't plan for. You just showed up, and they were there. He finished his eggs, his toast, the melon. He drank the last of his coffee slowly, the way he drank it when there was no particular rush, which was to say on Tuesdays, always. A couple came into the cafe, young, still wearing the slightly dazed expression of people who'd just figured out how to be happy together and hadn't gotten used to it yet. They took the table by the far wall. Dot had their order before they'd finished reading the menu. An older man came in alone, newspaper folded under his arm, and sat at the counter. He and Dot exchanged some words James couldn't hear. Both of them laughed at something. The man opened his newspaper. James sat for a moment after he'd finished. Not because he had nothing to go to. He had plenty. A 2 o'clock call with David about the next phase of the Vine Street case. A curriculum review for Brianna's program. She'd asked him to consider extending another semester. And he'd been considering it, and he'd mostly already decided. A message from the Robinson family about a follow-up question on relocation rights he'd promised to address before the end of the week. The Hartwell archivator, still sitting on his desk, waiting for him to finish going through the back study files. And the 3 pages in Ruth's handwriting, which he still didn't know quite what to do with and suspected he wouldn't for some time, and had decided that was acceptable. Some things you carried without knowing yet what they meant. You kept moving. You let them mean what they were going to mean on their own schedule. He sat because the sitting was earned. Because this specific Tuesday, this cafe, this table, this mug, this May morning light on the window, was something he had chosen for himself a long time ago and intended to keep choosing. Because some things you hold on to, not because they're grand or consequential, but because they're yours. Because they're the steady rhythm underneath the years. Because without them the years would be only what happened, with no thread running through. Because Ruth had said, "Your real job." And she had been right. Because Dot had written in a blue notebook for 8 years, for her mother, for herself, for the block, for no declared reason and every reason. Because Yvonne Reese had stood outside a door for 2 minutes and then knocked. Because a boy on a bike had watched from the curb with a face full of something he didn't yet have languages for. And one day he would, and what he did with it then was something James would never know, which was fine. That was how it worked. You showed up. You tried to do the right thing in the right way, and then it moved forward without you into lives you'd never see. Because his father's voice had been louder than everything else on the sidewalk that October morning. Had been louder, turned out, than the cuffs and the concrete and the 43 years of accumulated fatigue of being a black man in a country that kept deciding, in new configurations and old ones, to test whether your dignity was conditional. His father had taught him it wasn't. Ruth had spent 31 years confirming it. He had spent 62 years proving it, one morning at a time, which was the only way you could prove it. Not in a single moment of resistance or triumph, but in the accumulation, in showing up, in walking the same route on the same morning with your hands in your pockets and your pace your own. Because 62 years was not too late and too early. Because the Vine Street's case was going the right direction. Because Brianna's students had reached for their pens at the same moment. Because Mrs. Briggs intended to be buried from her house. He left $4 under the mug. He stood. He buttoned his vest, the navy one, rested now, back where it belonged, still the color of deep water just before dawn. He picked up his bag. He said goodbye to Dot, who lifted one hand from behind the counter without turning around, which was its own complete language between people who had known each other 30 years. He pushed the door open. The bell chimed. He stepped out into the May morning. He did not hurry. He had never hurried when it wasn't necessary, and he'd learned over 62 years to be very clear about what was necessary and what so simply the world asking you to move faster than was good for you. His father had taught him that distinction. Ruth had loved him for holding it. The city tested it. On sidewalks, in holding cells, in the long patience of cases that move through their phases without asking for your timeline. And he had held it each time. Not because it was easy, because it was his. He walked. The elm on Marbury, leaning left, listening to whatever it had been listening to for decades. The ribbon on the fence on Decatur, still tied, patient as anything has ever been. The light on Fifth, long and warm and honest, making no promises it couldn't keep. He walked through all of it, past the bus stop where the woman had turned round that October morning to watch. Past the corner where the boy on the bike had balanced with one foot on the curb. Past the place on the sidewalk, 6 steps from the door of the cafe, where everything had changed and everything had stayed the same. He did not stop. He kept walking. He was not finished. He was not anywhere near finished. And that, not the ruling, not the notebook, not the charge as filed in April, not even the classroom and the 14 students and the simultaneous reaching for pens. That was the point. The walking, the showing up, the Tuesday morning, and the one after that, and the one after that. The point was the continuing.